Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, including some friends who haven't been here that often as we venture into an area we care about but don't always give as much attention to as we should. Today's book, Confronting the Curse by Cullen Hendricks and Marcus Noland, radically changes that and puts us in the center of some critical issues and debates, and I'm very grateful to the authors for this outstanding piece of work and very excited to be sharing it with you and all our friends out there on live stream on the web and podcasting as we go. I think the book's title is very apt. It's both the economics and the geopolitics of confronting the natural resource governance. And we mean every word in the title. You're not going to make the curse of resource windfalls go away. You have to confront it head on and think about it. There are economic factors to determine how well you're able to cope with and manage the capital inflows, the foreign investment, the distortions in the economy, the reallocations that matter. But there are also profound geopolitical aspects to how countries are able to weather the poisoned occasionally chalice of natural resource blessings. And in particular, it is about governance. Just as in growth literature and economics, as many of you know, we've moved more and more to saying it's all institutions. Our authors, Hendricks and Noland, find that institutions, both domestically and in the international sphere, are the key determinant for how well emerging markets can utilize their natural resource bounty. But it's not just an empty, platitudinous thing, say, be nice, be democratic, and all will be well. Cullen and Mark have a very sophisticated, and I'm proud to say, a very thoroughly original empirical take on what has been going on throughout countries in the world, and particularly in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, what has been going on as a result of foreign investment in the current resource boom, particularly Chinese foreign investment. And they come to a number of conclusions that seem to be very sound, very practical, and to some degree unexpected. I won't scoop our authors, I'll let them tell it to you, but I will just say that this is a perfect work of policy analysis, broad inclusion of necessary variables, parsimony without getting into ridiculous modeling, and clear policy implications. And so I'm very proud the Peterson Institute is releasing this book today. Let me just quickly introduce the authors. Cullen Hendricks, who has now joined us as a non-resident senior fellow, is an assistant professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, which, as many of you know, is probably the leading international relations school west of Chicago. He's been a consultant for U.S. Department of Defense, the FAO, the World Food Program, the Asian Development Bank. He is a very distinguished rising star in empirical political science, where it joins with development. We're looking forward to continuing to work with him and publishing more of his work, both jointly and alone in future. Equal co-author and lead-off speaker today is Marcus Noland, who I think all of you know, and I'm very proud to say is now the Executive Vice President and Director of Studies here at the Peterson Institute. Mark has been with the Institute on and off, mostly on, thank goodness, since 1985. He's a senior fellow currently at the East-West Center. He served in the U.S. government as senior economist at the CEA. He's been a researcher and a teacher at Yale, at Johns Hopkins, at USC, but also at Tokyo University, the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies in Japan, the University of Ghana, and the Korea Development Institute. Many of you know him as our economist of unpleasant regimes. He is the world's leading thinker on what really is happening in North Korea and what it really means. He did fabulous work with Howard Pack previously on the Middle East that was in many ways, of course, not getting the call exactly right, but laid bare the foundations of what became the Arab Spring. And I am delighted to be able to publish this book. Sorry to repeat myself, but I think this is a genuinely great piece of work. So, Mark, over to you.
Thank you very much for that generous introduction. It takes the efforts of a lot of people to go from the thoughts in your head to an actual book. And Cullen and I would like to start by thanking Kevin Staler, who was our assistant for most of this process, Steve Weissman and the publications department here at the Institute, in particular Barbara Carney, who was our editor, and without whom this book would not exist. We'd also like to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come out here and listen to what we have to say, both those of you who are physically present and those of you who are watching these proceedings through the live streaming. I have a friend in Hawaii who indicated great interest in this event, and I explained that I thought that the proceedings would start around 12:15 Washington time, which would be 6:15 in the morning Hawaii time. She asked me, 6:15? I said, yeah, 6:15. 6:15 is a little earlier than I normally roll. So we would also like to welcome those of you watching on tape delay. The note to Adam. One thing I've noticed by watching the files of these events, once we do put them up on the website, is that the speaker is mic'd, but the audience is not. So the speaker says something funny, and you really don't get the audience reaction. So I'm sure Jeff Cordeaux can cook up a laugh track that we can use, for future presentations. All right. On to serious business. Truly serious business. I am the father of twins, the proud father of twins. And if on the day they were born, I had given one of those babies a big pot of gold, and I had given the other one nothing, and we checked back in 25 or 30 years, we'd probably expect the one who had gotten the big pot of gold to be further ahead, to be more wealthy and more prosperous. But when you look at countries, that doesn't actually seem to be the case. Countries for which natural resource wealth accounts for a large share of their wealth seem to be poor. And countries that are rich tend not to have very many resources. And so the question is, which way does that causality run? Does it run from something about resources inhibiting growth and development? Or is it that countries that are poor have poor institutions? And as a consequence, they don't develop more complex forms of activity, and the reliance on extraction is a symptom, not a cause. These issues appear to be particularly acute with respect to so-called point source resources. That is to say, resources such as oil, mining, which tend to be geographically concentrated and appear to be particularly subject to contestation and conflict. I will quite literally never forget the moment in the evening, June 2007, when my Ghanaian wife, who's here today, and I were sitting down to dinner. I had the BBC on the satellite radio, and the BBC announced that oil had been discovered off the coast of Ghana. And the tone of our dinner conversation that night was less, we're in the money, than, oh no. And that doubting response typifies the increasing ambivalence with which citizens in countries with major resource discoveries regard them as both blessings but also potentially curses. In the case of Ghana, the issue is whether its economic and political institutions are capable of successfully managing the sudden influx of income and wealth, and that the production of oil is likely to bring, and is indeed bringing, or whether the oil wealth will complicate macroeconomic management to the detriment of traditional industries and encourage a reversal of the country's steady yet still fragile evolution into a mature democracy. So let me quickly review the main findings of the book. We find that the presence of natural resources does present some economic challenges. The real issue is its impact on domestic political institutions and governance. The influx of wealth severs a critical link between the state and the citizenry, taxation and the accountability it demands, and enables substandard practices, and in the extreme, can contribute to political instability and even civil war. Here in the United States, in our revolution, we had a slogan, no taxation without representation. In some of these countries, the slogan is no representation without taxation. And the effects don't stop at home. With respect to external behavior, resource-centric states are unusually prone to conflict, and high prices may encourage aggressive behavior. In this interstate context, considerable interest centers on China's emergence as a major importer and investor in extraction, particularly in Africa. But we conclude that China's behavior may not be as rogue as some commentators suggest. Finally, in recent years, a number of multilateral good governance initiatives, such as the Kimberley process with respect to conflict diamonds, and the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which centers on the oil and mining industries, have come to the fore. But their long-run viability lies in getting buy-in from increasingly important non-Western producers and non-Western consumers. So let me go to that first main finding having to do with economics. Resource endowments matter for economic performance. One hypothesis is declining terms of trade. We now have literally hundreds of years of data of admittedly variable quality on commodity prices. And it appears that the so-called Praber-Singer hypothesis of declining secular terms of trade holds for a handful of commodities. And if you look at those commodities and who concentrates in the exportation of them, it appears that such concerns about declining terms of trade would be relevant for a small number of relatively small and mostly African economies. Obviously, this is an important issue for these economies. But in terms of kind of a global scale issue, declining terms of trade doesn't seem to be the case. And indeed, over the last 20 years or so, probably we've been more concerned with rising commodity prices rather than falling commodity prices. Second issue is commodity price volatility. And again, we have hundreds of years of data. And it appears that indeed, commodity prices are more volatile than prices of industrial products. But this hasn't increased over time. The problem hasn't gotten worse. There's an issue of resource pulls and crowding out. Some of the fastest growing economies in the last half century, countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, have been noticeable in their resource lack of resource abundance. And there's evidence that the existence of resources delays and attenuates specialization in industrial activities. In other words, if you're sitting on a gold mine, people are going to be working in the mining industry. They're going to be earning relatively high wages. So if you're an entrepreneur trying to get a manufacturing operation started, you're going to have to pay relatively high wages to hire your workers. So these countries tend to go into manufacturing relatively later in their development process, and they tend to specialize in manufacturers and other industrial products less. Finally, there's the issue of Dutch disease, named after the discovery of natural gas off the coast of Holland in the 1950s. It's a kind of terms of trade shock argument that the discovery leads to capital inflows and appreciation of the real exchange rate, which prices traditional industries out of the market. And there's evidence that Dutch disease does exist, and it does pose a drag on these economies. And each of these considerations, declining secular terms of trade, commodity price volatility, resource pulls, Dutch disease, there are technocratic, if not solutions, technocratic ways of mitigating these effects. The problem is that these solutions require a certain degree of institutional capacity in their implementation, and therein lies the problems. The countries with the greatest challenges in terms of resource management tend to be the countries that have the least state capacity. And at this point, I'll turn things over to Cullen.
Thanks, Mark, and thank you all for being here today. So as Marcus argued, most of the purely economic explanations for the resource curse are insufficient for really directly explaining the correlation between dependence on these point source natural resources and slow growth. Moreover, as Marcus mentioned, many of these issues can be addressed via certain policy levers. Awareness, however, of these policy levers is not a sufficient condition for their implementation. Governance is key, and in particular, political will, especially when doing the right thing from a technical perspective or a macroeconomic management perspective, runs up against the near-term interests of governments, regimes, and/or key stakeholders. So we conceive of these macroeconomic issues as symptoms of a deeper institutional disease. And because of that, the politics of natural resource wealth are essential for understanding why they're often a bane and not a boon to the countries that have them. So high-value mined commodities have negative effects for political democracy, bureaucratic and state capacity, and political stability, all of which exert direct or indirect effects on economic developments. Now, we could get down into the weeds on the causal mechanisms of all of those, but in the interest of saving a little bit of time, I think it's important to get to the central insight. And that is, as Mark mentioned earlier, that most of the political and institutional aspects of the resource curse result from that wealth obviating the need of states and sovereigns to bargain with the people that they govern for the resources that are necessary to sustain their rule. Point source resources, by their very nature, are easy for governments to tax or capture via non-tax mechanisms. So think for a moment of the different kind of administrative requirements that would be associated with a government like, say, the United States, where income, capital gains, and corporate taxes, and also payroll taxes make up about 91% of government revenue. So our IRS employs about 90,000 people. Contrast that, say, with the administrative requirements of revenue generation in a state like Nigeria, where the oil and gas sector accounts for 70% of state revenue. I was going to try and report the relevant staff sizes for those organizations, but when I went looking for the relevant information 3 days ago, this is what I got from the budget office. Okay. No offense to Nigerians in the office. So I figured then I would go to the Federal Ministry of Finance. Much clearer, right? Now, in the interest of fairness, when I went back today, the budget office is back online. The Ministry of Finance, however, is not. So these convenient tax handles disrupt the development of a fiscal contract between rulers and the ruled over the exchange of societal resources in return for government protection and services. Absent this contract, we often see authoritarian rule and bureaucracies which fail to develop professional, meritocratic rules, and their staffs can become dominated by patronage appointees rather than the best and the brightest. However, the negative impact of resource wealth on state capacity is contingent largely on the quality of pre-existing political institutions in these countries, and of certain aspects or attributes of the resources themselves. When the rule of law is pre-established and democratic institutions are already consolidated, these windfall profits from resources tend to be invested in ways that promote intergenerational equity and providing public goods to the general betterment of society. When pre-existing institutions are characterized by corruption and weakly institutionalized checks on the executive, the windfall is less likely to be invested in ways that promote the common good. Now, this doesn't portend very well for many of the new producers, many of which are characterized by relatively weak checks on governmental authority. They are, in a sense, in a race against time to lock in their nascent institutional reforms and democratization before that wealth comes online in full. Of course, this is easier said than done, especially since some of the effects of the resource curse manifest themselves before the resources are even tapped. Oil exploration, for example, is very big business for government officials who can reap large financial rewards, both legal and non-legal, from exploration licensing fees. Now, the effects for domestic unrest are contingent largely on the location of the resources and how they overlap with pre-existing patterns of social exclusion. Mineral extraction entails large, concentrated costs on communities in which it occurs. To the extent that this territory is in the homeland of ethnically, religiously, or other cultural groups who are excluded from power, like the Ogoni in Nigeria, grievances over exploitation and environmental costs can fuel participation in rebel movements. Moreover, the presence of these natural resources implies that territorial secession by these minority groups would leave them in control of a potentially economically viable state. Finally, we should mention that onshore oil and gas exploitation typically entails networks of infrastructure and is overseen by deep-pocketed oil companies, which make attractive targets for insurgents and terrorists, who may have limited capacity to hold and defend these installations, but significant capacity to extort. So this map shows the most frequent locations of attacks on oil and gas infrastructure by dissident groups from 1990 to 2011. Many of the attacks occurred near export terminals, such as in the Niger Delta, but there are other hotspots, notably in Colombia, Iraq, and Pakistan, which reflect the importance of these oil and gas infrastructure in the midst of conflicts that are not, we think, in any obvious sense about the underlying oil resources per se. We could quibble with that as it pertains to Iraq, but nevertheless. So that resources have kind of these pernicious sort of domestic effects is relatively well established. In the following chapter, we extend our analysis to look at the curse in the international arena and the effects of resource dependence on exporters' foreign affairs. Natural resource exporters, particularly oil exporters, are characterized by what Mike Ross and Eric Voten call unbalanced globalization. They're highly economically and financially integrated, but less well incorporated to regional and global institutions of governance. Now, states join international institutions for a variety of reasons, but among the most important is so that they can make credible commitments governing their domestic policies. These are particularly important for investment. Now, whatever the motive is for joining these organizations in the first place, membership in these institutions has powerful implications for reducing international conflict behavior, adherence to international norms and conventions, and particularly those governing human rights and environmental issues. For a variety of reasons, oil exporters may not need to join international institutions in the same ways as non-exporting countries. Resource exporters certainly don't seem to have problems finding markets for their goods, and investment capital is usually forthcoming even if the threat of expropriation is omnipresent because of its investment in fixed assets. Because of this, oil exporting countries are less well integrated than their non-oil exporting brethren in international organizations. And to the extent that you believe that these international organizations have systematic effects for peace and stability and global integration, this is somewhat sobering news. Well, what about price effects? What about conflict behavior? This should be relatively straightforward, as Vladimir Putin has spent a good chunk of the last 6 years making the following point for me, and that is that high energy prices embolden energy exporters to engage in more aggressive foreign policies. That's the what. Now we go to the why. We argue that this is due to three factors. First, because of oil's strategic significance as a resource, exporting countries may believe that they are indemnified from some losses on the battlefield because major powers, most of which are energy importers, so Russia being the outlier here, have incentives to intervene in order to stabilize global markets for these resources, which may, in fact, engender a bit of moral hazard, causing these oil exporters to engage in more saber-rattling than they would otherwise, absent this implicit security guarantee. If you think back to the first Gulf War, Kuwait's reported slant drilling in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq is an example of this mechanism in action. Second, oil exporters invest disproportionate resources in military capacity to secure themselves both against invasion and internal threats because of the effects on domestic political stability. And this can provoke security dilemma-like dynamics, in which neighboring countries are unable to tell what the intentions are of the states that are developing this military capacity, and thereby it can lead to arms race dynamics. Third, oil resources endow these governments with relatively significant resources that can be invested in military capacity, and also because of the negative effects for political democracy, tend to give them more of a free hand with which to pursue aggressive foreign policies. Now, these factors are true for energy exporters in general, but they may be particularly emboldening for some. So many oil-rich states, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Nigeria, and Gabon, seem pretty satisfied with their position in the international system and lack revisionist ambitions. Others, like Iran, Russia, Venezuela, have avowed desires to change the international order, and in some cases, the existing balance of power abroad, and, I should add, at home. So all of the mechanisms outlined earlier should be attenuated or amplified by prices. High prices increase the present discounted value of ownership of these resources, i.e. how much you'd like to control them, potentially making oil-rich countries more attractive targets for conquest. The moral hazard dynamics I outlined earlier should be greater when prices are higher. And finally, large military expenditures are tied to government revenues. When prices are low, government revenues are low. When prices are high, government revenues are going to be higher. In the book and in the accompanying working paper, we provide very strong evidence to suggest that oil exporters' bellicosity, the amount of saber rattling they do in the international system, the amount of aggressive positions they take against their neighboring countries, is indeed a function of higher prices. All right, so higher prices embolden these actors in ways that low prices do not. So a question is whether or not the United States' emergence as an energy exporter is going to fundamentally alter this picture. Part of the sales pitch domestically for energy investment is a decoupling of U.S. foreign policy interests from major exporters, particularly in the Middle East, and a lowering of global prices. Now, the rise of the United States as an energy exporter is unlikely to diminish the importance of foreign oil producers for U.S. foreign policy. Key U.S. allies and linchpins of the global economy in Europe and Asia will remain import dependent for the foreseeable future. And to the extent that the health of the U.S. economy is contingent on the health of our largest trading partners and military allies, supply shocks in global markets will continue to have clear economic and security implications for an energy-independent United States. So far we've considered the systematic effects of natural resource dependence on the foreign affairs of exporters. But what about major importers? The resource curse may affect large importing countries as well, insofar as it shapes their foreign policies to a significant degree. That access to strategic natural resources shapes U.S. foreign policy is scarcely in need of mention. From World War II to the Eisenhower and Carter doctrines and the Iraq wars, U.S. foreign policy has reflected the primacy of energy interests and concerns. The more contested role is that of China, whose meteoric rise as a global trader and investor is unparalleled, and which, unlike the United States, will not reverse its trend of increasing energy imports in the near or even middle term. Moreover, its large current account surpluses have translated into a comparatively free hand for it to significantly expand its outward economic and security ties with the rest of the world in terms of outward foreign direct investment, or OFDI, development finance, or aid, in which it has become a very major player, and military assistance and sales. From a liberal market perspective, this increased integration in the global economy could be viewed as a very good thing. Trade and financial integration tend to pacify relations between states, raising the opportunity costs associated with conflict and creating vested domestic interest in both that prefer peace to war. However, not all observers are cheerful about China's rise as a major trader, source of FDI, and aid donor. Indeed, the prevailing conventional wisdom is highly skeptical, if not downright contemptuous. Moises Naim, for example, has called Chinese development assistance rogue aid, claiming it is development assistance that is non-democratic in origin and non-transparent in practice. Its effect is typically to stifle real progress while hurting average citizens. Stefan Halper argues that China prefers to invest in non-democratic countries and is actually actively seeking to subvert the post-war international order consisting of the United Nations, the IMF, the WTO, and related organizations that have facilitated global economic integration. So hyperbolic statements aside, the factors that shape China's foreign policy have not been subject to much rigorous empirical analysis, with policy discussions driven largely by anecdotal evidence. So China's outward FDI is clearly targeted towards extractive industries. Previous Peterson Institute research found that 3/4 of Chinese OFDI to Latin America was targeted at metals, coal, natural gas, and oil. And that's research that was done by Ted Moran and Barbara Kochwar. Barbara, you're here today. Thank you very much. Whether this is a problem sort of hinges on whether or not you think that these investments are essentially reallocating ownership rights to an essentially fixed stock of natural capital, or whether you believe that the stock of natural capital is in some sense expandable. It turns out that the latter, there's more evidence of the latter than the former. In the last decade, as we've seen a dramatic increase in global prices for these traded commodities, we've seen a large increase in investment in these extractive sectors. And even given the large lag times in extractives from investment to actually bringing products to market, we've seen significant upward revisions of our reserve estimates for most of these valuable globally traded commodities. And just how rogue is China's aid? Well, new data on Chinese development assistance in Africa, collected by my former colleagues at the College of William & Mary, can help us do rigorous empirical tests of this rogue aid hypothesis. At first blush, Chinese aid does seem to be overly targeted towards resource-seeking activities. So the top 10 recipient countries in Africa are home to about 50% of the region's natural capital, and 41% of the region's population, but receive 2/3 of all Chinese aid allocations. However, these questions are much better addressed with multivariate models, which can include proxies for need like population and level of development, and other issues in the international arena about which China cares deeply. So, in principle, diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. Our findings are pretty clear. There's only modest evidence of a resource-seeking bent in Chinese development assistance, with the primary drivers being population and diplomatic recognition of Taiwan. So lastly, we discuss arms exports and transfers. Like many other large industrial countries, China has sought out a path of self-sufficiency in the production of arms, resulting in a large defense sector that has made China a top 10 exporter of military technology. However, China is far from being the top player. Between 1990 and 2011, China's share of global arms transfers averaged about 3.1%. For most of the post-Cold War era, China's total military transfers, excluding small arms, which are freely available from a variety of producers, were comparable to those of the Netherlands, a country with an economy roughly 1/16 the size of China's. Again, careful econometric analysis provides relatively weak evidence of a resource-seeking bias in China's arms transfers. If anything, the evidence is as strong or stronger for a resource-seeking bias in the United States arms transfers to the region. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Marcus. Thank you.
So China's rise occurs against the backdrop of the West broadly encompassing Western NGOs, Western governments, and the multilateral institutions that they dominate, such as the World Bank, attempting to formulate new ways of addressing the resource curse. These initiatives, for example, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, can be regarded as a way to assuage troubled consciences, act as a pre-commitment mechanisms to forestall more damaging forms of intervention, and to promote more humane and rational uses of these resources. Whether they can be effective, and crucially, what role China will play with respect to these efforts remain open questions. The origins of these three initiatives we discuss in the book, the Kimberley Process on conflict diamonds, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, which started out focusing on oil and mining but has been broadened to encompass timber and other products, and then finally the Conflict Minerals Trade Act, all have their origins in Western and indeed Anglophone NGO or human rights campaigns that were based on a strategy of naming and shaming. And as a consequence, their effectiveness is a function of producer sensitivity to reputational concerns. And I can't overemphasize this. These ways that we are developing of managing or addressing these issues are not the product of textbook economics. They are the product of what I would have to say is truly extraordinary policy entrepreneurship by some NGOs. And as a consequence, the structure of these initiatives reflect these basic political tactical decisions that the NGOs took on in their origins. And that is to say, an emphasis on naming and shaming. That in turn requires the target to actually have reputational concerns. Now, these reputational concerns are a function of easily identifiable or branded products, industry concentration, the alignment of interests in the dominant powers, and then the ubiquity of, or at least the effectiveness of this, not the reputational concerns themselves, the ubiquity of alternative supply sources, the technical ability to implement certification schemes, and so on. So for example, when the Kimberley process on conflict diamonds was established, De Beers was effectively a monopolist. It completely internalized the industry's externalities. The US and other major consuming countries were not producers, so there were no producer lobbies in the United States or Europe to oppose regulation. Indeed, these countries were supportive, as were other major producing areas such as South Africa and Botswana, which for technical reasons produced diamonds that were not associated with political conflict. Such conditions were present in weaker form when EITI was introduced, initially focusing on the petroleum sector. So you do have branded gasoline, you do have the major multinational companies that have reputations to protect, but it is a more oligopolistic industry with a greater kind of competitive fringe. And these conditions for success appear to be least fortuitous in the case of conflict minerals, where the industry, the relevant industry, is the electronic sector, which is very large and highly diverse. So in the book, we go through an analysis of the effectiveness of each of these initiatives. But the key issue looking forward is whether these initiatives that are based on Western norms can survive a shift in demand to non-Western countries and the growing importance of non-Western producers that may not be subject to the same reputational or political pressures. So for example, if you look at the diamond sector, the amount of jewelry purchased by, say, American OECD consumers is a rapidly falling share of the jewelry industry. And if you look at petroleum or mining, non-Western producers, including China, are increasingly prominent. So in the words of V.I. Lenin, what is to be done? The resource curse is real, but it's not destiny. Economic policy fixes, well, maybe fixes is too strong a term, but economic policies can be undertaken to at least mitigate some of these effects. But they require strong institutions to implement effectively. And the positive cases of highly successful resource-centric economies like Norway or Botswana simply underline the importance of institutional quality pre-windfall. But what happens? But you don't get to choose you don't get to choose your institutional quality, and you don't get to choose the timing of the windfall. So what happens if the windfall occurs in a country with weak or developing institutions such as Ghana? There is some evidence that the nature of ownership, public versus private matters, with private ownership being associated with somewhat better outcomes. And many of the resource discoveries occur today in countries which need foreign assistance in extraction. And the example of offshore oil in Ghana is a wonderful case in point. In this situation, we argue in the book that multi-stakeholder projects involving Western and non-Western firms may be advisable. Such arrangements can effectively combine the pressure that the Western companies are facing from their governments to implement good governance policies and basically create a ratcheting up effect or a race to the top, together with willingness of some of these Western newcoming producers to take more risks and provide capital. It creates sunshine. If you have joint ventures involving Western and non-Western companies, you're more likely to have business done more openly to the benefit of the host country. And indeed, if you manage to get producers from a variety of major countries, you can, in some sense, play them off against each other for greater host country autonomy. Thank you for your attention. I know we've gone a bit long, but we still have some time for questions, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Have guessed, the Peterson Institute does not suffer from a resource curse. We're doing the best we can with these mics. The issues raised, and more importantly, the empirical patterns uncovered and analyzed by Cullen and Mark, I think, are striking, original, and important. I can put to them some questions, but we do, I know from the list, have a lot of expertise in this audience. So I'd like to encourage people who want to make a comment or preferably a question to do so. As usual, we have Jessica with a roving mic up front. People towards the back can go to the standing microphone and just raise your hand to be recognized. Please. And please identify yourself to the room when you ask a question.
Hi, I'm Welby Lehman from House Ways and Means. Chinese FDI in this sector is disproportionately by SOEs, by state-owned enterprises. That's also the case for Brazil's Petrobras in Angola and lots of other examples. But it does distinguish Chinese FDI in the sector from U.S. FDI in the sector. What are the advantages and disadvantages for host countries of SOE investment in the sector?
If any.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that. Thank you for the question. So in the book, we spend a little bit of time talking about this kind of critical distinction. And actually, some of the economists who've been working very, very closely on Chinese FDI, even more closely than myself, have been able to kind of disaggregate it, decompose it into these two different types of categories. And one of the empirical patterns that emerges is that a lot of what we think of as being kind of rogue Chinese aid, or rogue Chinese investment, to use Moises Naim's terms, is actually emanating from these state-owned enterprises, right? So it's more heavily targeted towards countries with weaker governance institutions and larger stocks of natural capital. Now, I think it's important to keep in mind that that doesn't necessarily imply some sort of nefarious intent, right? So in the governance chapter, Mark talks about the success of many of these good governance initiatives in essentially changing the regulatory environment that Western firms face. And this is actually something that predates sort of these modern campaigns. We think about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or something like that. So if Western firms are essentially precluded from doing business in many of these environments, or doing business as it is often done in these types of environments, then they're going to be comparatively undercapitalized, and that's going to imply a much higher rate of return for these Chinese state-owned enterprises. There's also something to the argument that these Chinese state-owned enterprises have potentially more experience navigating getting business done in these types of governance environments, and that therefore they have some comparative advantages in seeking out returns in these contexts.
Great. Another question? Yeah. Okay. If you could head towards the back, Mike, you can be next. And no, I meant the man behind you, and then yeah. Jessica, try to get a microphone over there to the man in the white shirt, and the man in the black suit can ask his question from the back mic.
Andrea Larion of Peterson Institute. Dear Marcus and dear Colin, I have a problem. So there is a very good book, it's a lot of information, and a lot of literature has been used. But it seems to me there is a problem with the very concept, and probably with the title of the book. Let me explain what I have as a comment or a question to both of you.
Keep it short, please.
I'll try my best.
If not, I'll cut you off.
Right. Just first is the definition of the resource curse. You have some kind of on page 4, some potentially deleterious impact of natural resources on development is captured in the phrase the resource curse. And also some kind of disadvantage long-term economic trajectory. Next para. So, but if we look into the graphs that you presented here, as well as in the book, we would see that this is a line is almost strongly horizontal, which suggests that probably there is no statistically significant correlation or relationship between the natural wealth and economic growth or economic development, regardless how it will be defined. So that is why it is rather hard to see whether we can see this resource curse with this negative relationship. And the other one, on the other hand, if we just listen to you and your suggestions, and also in the book, there is always some kind of comments about the institutional diseases, broken fiscal contract, and resource cost is real but not destiny. So which suggests probably that you are talking mostly not about the resource curse, but about institutional curse or fiscal contract curse or something like that. Maybe the title would be different, not about the resource curse, so confronting the curse, but confronting the institutional curse, not so much resource curse.
Thank you. That was concise. Mark.
So, honestly, I don't think there's probably that much distance between the two of us. What we argue in the book is if you look at the direct economic impact of resource endowments on economic performance, there's slightly negative relationship. It is not strong, it's not overwhelming, as you observed. However, if you go on to read the book, there are indirect impacts. For example, on the role and functioning of the state, the implications of that for human capital accumulation, and so on. And so when you add in these more indirect effects, you start to get a bigger effect. And it is indeed through the domestic political institutions, as I think we tried to argue. You would be very interested, I think, that there is a forthcoming paper in the Journal of Comparative Economics. It's forthcoming, and it came out too recently for us to incorporate it in the book. But it actually looks at your former country, the Soviet Union. And what it does is, because the sort of breakup of the Soviet Union, or the revolution that you were a key part of, is an extraordinary natural experiment. I don't like to use the term natural experiment because it sounds like people are laboratory rats. But you had a situation where you had a very clear set of institutions, and then those institutions were overturned. And you have provinces that have very different resource endowments. And what happens if you track the evolution of those provinces over the last 20, 25 years, the provinces that had the greatest mining resources have done the worst with respect to corruption, with respect to small and medium enterprise formation, with respect to antitrust issues, and so on. So I don't think we can argue about labels, but I don't think we're really that far apart. We argue that at base, that the ultimate argument for the resource curse is not secular declining terms of trade, it's the impact on domestic institutions. I think we're in agreement.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully done. Gentleman in the white shirt, and then if the lady in the red sweater could go to the back mic.
Kurt.
To the back mic after this question. Thank you.
Kurt Schuler from the U.S. Treasury Department. Since we were just talking about the Soviet Union, let me suggest something to you that the United States is one of the very few countries in the world where the subsoil is mainly privately owned. In the rest of the world, the subsoil is, most other countries, the subsoil is owned by the government. So do we have, in effect, a giant Soviet Union of the subsoil around the world with the, the concomitant inefficiencies that arise from government monopoly ownership of the subsoil, and therefore is a good step to take to privatize the subsoil?
So in our chapter on policy implications, that's definitely something, an issue that we take up. So one of the arguments here, the core argument, revolves around this kind of fiscal contract, this broken fiscal contract. And if those resources were not in the hands of the state with which to begin, right, if they were in private hands, you would still need to develop relatively sophisticated revenue-generating instruments, right, and also have some incentives to defer to the kind of policies that those resource owners have if you actually have to engage in some sort of negotiation over access to that revenue, right? So this is, in a sense, an argument for privatization. From my perspective, it's not necessarily an ideological argument, it's a very practical kind of argument. When those resources are monopolized by the state, you're much more likely to see these types of institutional problems emerge and develop. And there's some evidence in the macroeconomic literature on this stuff to suggest that states with poor governance institutions were the ones that were more likely to nationalize these types of resources. In fact, Michael Ross, who is one of, not a reviewer, but somebody who's taken a good look at the book and who's pretty active in this literature, would make the argument that you really start to see these pernicious effects of oil wealth, in particular on political democracy, following this period of nationalizations. So that it facilitated a move towards more authoritarian governments in those societies. So I'm not sure if I would say that they're all the Soviet Union. I think in many of these places you'd be kind of happy to see sort of the level of institutionalization that obtained under Soviet rule, if not the specific policies that they pursued.
Very nice. Please.
Hi, my name is Federica Bindi. I'm at SAIS, across the road. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I look forward to reading the book and dipping more in some of your arguments. Now, as a political scientist, of course, I completely support the argument that domestic institutions matter. I mean, they matter in economics, matters this. As far as and even good states, if you say, like Norway, if you think, you were talking about small and medium enterprises, they failed because the oil crushed the medium enterprises system of Norway. So even the good ones have problems. Now, what I'm interested in, however, is that historically, resources always lead to bellicose foreign policy and to wars. You know, it was gold, it was war, and it is oil today. So when you are suggesting possible solutions, I completely buy your arguments and strengthen institutions, especially, it's an importance. But I also wonder if we shouldn't start to talk about diffusing the whole thing. And how do you diffuse the problem? You make extraction oil less relevant. And how do you do it? Using, well, of course, increasing efficiency in terms of energy efficiency. So, for instance, what Obama has just announced, in a way, goes toward that. Your numbers show that energy efficiency is increasing in the Western world, by the way, but also alternative source of energy. I mean, it will be harder probably to affect consumption in Asia, but definitely in places like Europe or us, and natural resources can change completely in the equation. So I wonder how you see that into your perspective.
Thank you. I mean, even political scientists can assume a can opener at times. Mark, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I'm in favor of energy efficiency. And in terms of diffusing things, where I thought you were going to go with that question is the proposal we make at the end of the book, and I covered at the very end of my remarks, which is that if you're worried about rivalry and external aggression and instability, and you are one of these new producers who discovers some sort of deposit, whether you're Mongolia in copper or Ghana in oil or wherever, and you're going to need foreign assistance to develop that resource, then a joint venture between an American and a Chinese firm might not be that bad, because the CIA or their Chinese counterparts aren't going to have a monopoly kind of interests in the country. And you will have more of a balanced portfolio, so to speak, and you can play them off against each other. So if I were diffusing things, the way I would diffuse it is create as many joint ventures between Western and non-Western or US and Chinese producers as I could.
Thank you.
Go ahead. Just real quickly on that, I'm broadly in agreement with the points that you're making. The only addendum that I would add on to Mark's comments is that in the presentation I was able to cover sort of the price effects going one direction, right, with high prices emboldening these governments to engage in these more bellicose foreign policies. But the risk is not sort of completely one-sided. So when you have very low prices, all right, you have lowered government revenues in many states that have really made commitments to large programs of kind of consumer subsidies and social spending a huge part of the kind of social contract that they have. So if that is to collapse, right, the overall sort of security implications for the United States of, say, regime instability in the Middle East as a function of those governments' inability to maintain their commitments to these types of consumer subsidies, it's not obvious to me that that's a better set of problems to have. So that there is some risk associated with this on both sides. I wish I had a better explanation for how we could get away from that, but I did want to flag that.
Okay. At the back mic, and then if someone wants to raise their hands, I'll get you in the queue.
Thank you. Lex Riefel at the Brookings Institution. I think ownership of the resources is at the heart of the problem. But I wonder if privatization really is going in the wrong direction. We should ask ourselves, it seems to me at the beginning, who owns these resources? Who put these resources there? And it wasn't even the governments of these countries that put the resources there. In a sense, they belong to all of us. And what seems to me missing in this debate is that the resources belong to all of us. In a sense, the oil in Saudi Arabia belongs to us Americans as much as our uranium or whatever it is, our shale oil, gas in the United States belongs to the Saudis. And it seems to me if the world had this sense that the natural resources belong to all of us and they need to be used for the benefit of all of us, we would be we would be working from a higher moral ground. The other comment is that I don't think it's institutions that are the problem. It's people. It's people who have power and authority, and especially when I say power, guns. It's the people. You have to look at the people who have the guns. You have to map. I don't think we're going to get anywhere in this in terms of solving this issue until we're able to map the vested interests and co-opt the vested interests into using the resources they control for the benefit of a larger group of people.
Well, Lex, I think the first part of your question and the second part, or the first question and the second question, actually are contradictory. They actually the second one answers the first. I mean, look, if we had a utopian world in which, everybody is a kind of communitarian paradise where everybody owned everything, then yeah, I mean, if people were all angels, yes, of course. But I have, I'm a believing Christian. I believe God put the resources underground. I think men are flawed and sinful, and I think we have to protect ourselves against each other's impulses. And that's one of the beautiful things about the American system. Founding fathers grasped this. They set up a form of government in which we actually have checks and balances on each other. And so what Cullen and I are trying to do in this book is basically say, given this situation, what are kinds of institutions that we can build that essentially put checks on the egotistical impulses of people, whether they be political leaders or warlords, digging up diamonds in Sierra Leone or Liberia or whomever. So I think the second question you asked is exactly what we're trying to do in the book to address the fact that the first part of your question is probably not going to occur, at least not in my lifetime.
Up here at front, Jessica, this, and then if the gentleman in glasses could go to the back mic, gets you in the brown plaid shirt.
Hi there, I'm Karen Sinhaji. I'm the Director of International Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Interior. And as you may know, this administration has signed up for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And I've been actively involved in pulling that together from the outset. And it's been fascinating to watch. And I appreciate your shout out to the entrepreneurship of the policy innovations that have occurred. And just interestingly for us, one of the biggest challenges has been bringing together the private sector and the NGOs and the government together around one table, and people who normally intersect with one another via press release or worse via litigation are all sitting down together, working together towards a common goal of trying to create transparency around the resources that we're extracting. We took for granted how easy it might be in the United States to do this, and in fact it could be quite challenging anywhere this could happen. But I'd welcome your thoughts and comments on the importance of bringing those three elements together. You talk about the importance of institutions, and I take away from that you're meaning government institutions, but the fact that you have a robust civil society sector and industry that's willing to sit down together with those three components, I think is quite interesting to me.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that we did, in the interest of time, I didn't go into this, but in the book, we actually go through that in a certain amount of detail. I mean, EITI will work in countries where people want it to work. You can game EITI by a point. The way EITI basically works, for the 90% of you here that don't know how it works, It basically runs off of two ideas. One is an idea about disclosure of information, who's paying whom, and then the publication and the dissemination of this information. So what you need is you need somebody, an accountant, who can actually make sure the books are actually correct, these statements of the payments are actually correct. And you need a body that is supposed to disseminate this information to the public, who can then put pressure on their government to be accountable with respect to the activities in the sector. If a government does not want EITI to work, it can do so by packing that national body with cronies and corrupt people and so on. If you want it to work, you can select better people in your body. But it's not just who you select in your body. If your country has a robust private press, for example, like Ghana does, the press actually acts in the way that it's supposed to, by shining a light on these practices of the government and so on. This initiative, as I said, was the product of a specific political campaign. So it focuses very specifically on one point in the production process, the payments of the producers to the government. It doesn't look upstream to procurement, licensing, as Colin mentioned. It doesn't look downstream to expenditure. And now places like the World Bank are developing a more holistic, broadening out from that one point in the chain to look more at the pre-production aspects where corruption occurs, as well as, okay, now we've gotten the money and the books are clear and people aren't stealing, how do we spend it? And so I think it is very important to pull these things together. And in some countries, even poor countries, this institution has a much better chance of working than in others. And it very much has to do with the robustness of civil society, NGOs, but particularly a free press.
Okay, I've got two questions waiting at the back.
Hi, Michael Finger. I compliment you on expanding the issue you're taking up to governance. I want to raise a specter which may lay in the background, which I'll describe, for lack of a better term, as the analysis curse. A few years ago, a couple of colleagues and I in South America were trying to explain why Peru and Argentina were going in different directions, and we were looking at institutions in terms of trade. And one of my friends came up with a quote from Shakespeare. Said, "The fault, dear Brutus, lies not in our stars, but in ourselves." That a lot of the difference was a matter of decisions. And once you reduce this to parameters and forces, you had taken away both the contribution these people had made and the suggestions that might follow. So I guess my question then for you is, can you find in your work stories about people who made a difference in these, not entrepreneurship by NGOs or some generic thing like that, but entrepreneurship by people on the spot? What did they see as their situation? What did they see as their objective? What did they want to do? And how did they do it? Stories of this sort might be more useful for the next person in a situation than these generalizations about central tendencies.
Before my colleagues respond, as they no doubt will quite thoughtfully, I have to point out that part of the job of the Institute is to look for general tendencies. And that if it turns out that it's individual decisions that matter more than institutions and the incentives that they create, then the institutions and incentives they create will not show up as a general tendency. So it's not circular, that's reality. So the eternal fantasy that it's about winning over individual policymakers is generally just that, a fantasy, and that's why the work of the Institute tends to be on actual policies to make a difference. But Mark, maybe you'd like to comment, or Colin?
The thing I guess I would add is that people are obviously important. For instance, governance of the extractive sector in Zimbabwe right now would be very different if Robert Mugabe had looked a little bit more like Nelson Mandela, right? Sometimes through these processes of national revolutions, you wind up with leaders who, for fairly idiosyncratic kind of personal reasons, wind up enacting policies that are very different from their brethren, even if you can broaden the comparison to Kenneth Kaunda in Zambia, for instance. That said, I think that one of the reasons why we like to focus on kind of institutions and transparency is that the hope is that once you have a democracy and a vibrant civil society and a free press, right, these institutions are going to act as checks against allowing those individuals to rise to positions of prominence. So moving forward, it's kind of beyond my wisdom, probably beyond the wisdom of Solomon, to identify ex ante who are going to be the right individuals to promote in these contexts. But my faith is in the institutions that govern these processes of leader selection, and that hopefully those can really make a difference and promote better outcomes.
Much better than anything I said.
Can I add something? I mean, look, leadership clearly matters. One of the things we spend a fair amount of time in the book talking about are fiscal policy rules. And you get leaders who are in tough situations that have the guts to go forward and do the right thing. And I think if you look at the history of Chile and how they've managed their copper wealth over the last 10 or 15 years, you will be impressed by the leadership quality of individual Chilean political leaders at that time. And if you contrast that with the leadership behavior of people, and I forgot, we gave 3 examples, Chad, Azerbaijan, and one other, where the leader just raided the sovereign wealth fund for whatever. So leadership matters at the high level. At the low level, I can't tell you the names of individual people who have made a difference, but what I can say is one of the arguments we make in the book is that contrary to sort of textbook public finance, that there may be scope when you talk about downstream expenditure patterns to have some dedicated income streams. Because if you know that X amount of the revenue from this oil project or this mine, and you know what the numbers are because of EITI, you know that's supposed to be going into the primary education budget. You know that your province and your town account for X amount of the budget. Then as a local person, you can say, where's my school building? And that is a way of imposing accountability on governments. So, I can't tell you the specific individuals in Mexico and Brazil who demanded that the school building or the health clinic be built, but they knew they had dedicated income streams and they knew the money should be coming in somewhere. And so if they didn't see it, then the question is, where'd it go?
And there again is an example of a good governance structure that empowers the people. Please.
Will Martin, thanks very much. Wonderful presentation, a really interesting looking book. I've only had a chance to glance. One thing I wondered is if it could be a bit more, if you could give us a little more on the distinction, the important differences between cases where a lot of the revenue ends up either in the construction phase or in operation as payments, wages and other factor payments to individuals rather than as essentially rent. I mean, it seems to me in the rent case, it's very easy for governments to get access to it, even if it's privately owned. One only needs to think of the shale oil here and all the delay in the process of getting export permits for that. And there are clearly also problems in the where the revenue arises in construction or operation. People deciding not to go to college because they can make $200,000 driving a truck. But these 2 cases seem very, very different, and I wondered if you had any observations on that.
Yeah, honestly, Will, I didn't totally follow that. Could you somehow restate? I lost the thread there.
Some natural resources show up, say oil, a pure enclave sector, bang. As far as the economy of the country is concerned, in many cases, it's just pure flow of foreign exchange. In other cases, in Australia, the shale gas here, the minerals in Australia, or the Chile case, there's actually a lot of domestic resources involved in constructing mines and on an ongoing basis digging them up, and that, or if you think of say the coffee, cocoa, quite often there's a lot of employment created in the activity or in the spending of the people who get the revenue. So there's a different situation depending on whether the revenue shows up in a rent form that can be directly taxed, or it flows to people involved in doing something in the hot sun. Thank you.
Right. So honestly, we didn't do much in the book making a distinction between outcomes in those two sorts of ways. One place we did sort of touch on that, however, was in the final chapter and the proposals for, and it's described in various ways, but what's it? Oil for cash or whatever, but it's the Alaska. You just take the money and it just gets handed to the people. And our cousins over at CGD are great proponents of this. Cullen and I are a little more skeptical, but we talked about sort of what would be some of the implications of having schemes to try to move money out of the public sector and more directly into the public sector, though it's not the distinction that you're making between extractive techniques that involve a lot of ancillary activity and those that do not.
I think just to make one small comment in addition to Mark's, first that while you're right, it is possible to make that distinction, and there may indeed be research looking at the labor intensity of the production as a determinant of outcomes. It is noteworthy that we are talking about mostly poor and therefore smaller countries that do that. I think it's a legitimate place of focus. But the second thing is, I was very struck in your comments about the truck driver at $200,000 a year. Not because I want that job, but in Spain during their real estate boom, you actually had a similar phenomenon. You had kids dropping out of high school and college to go work construction at 70,000 euros a year, wasting potential human capital and so on. So just to say, I think that aspect is more about the boom bust and not necessarily as much about natural resources per se. We've come to the end of our time. I just want to see whether Cullen or Marcus have anything particular they'd like to add. Terrific. Well, thank you all for engaging. And I should say in closing, I'm very grateful to the Smith-Richardson Foundation, whose vision about interactions of foreign policy and economics led to them supporting this work, and it was a huge help to have them engaged and give us the freedom to do this work by Cullen and Marcus. Thank you all very much.